So, picture this. You're the grandson of the legendary Genghis Khan. You've inherited the largest land empire in history. But instead of just ruling from the saddle like your ancestors, you decide to become the emperor of a settled ancient civilization. Well, that one choice created this massive dilemma that would define your entire life. Are you a Mongol conqueror or are you a Chinese ruler? And this right here, this was the question, the criticism really, that Mongol traditionalists were throwing at Kublai. You see, they saw his fascination with Chinese culture as a total betrayal of his heritage, the very nomadic ways that built the empire in the first place. And believe me, this wasn't just some casual complaint, it was the central conflict of his entire life. So that brings us to the big question, right? How on earth did a prince from the steppes not only conquer, but completely remake the world's oldest continuous civilization? Because he didn't just win battles, he had to figure out how to govern, how to somehow blend the raw, unstoppable power of the Mongols with the super sophisticated bureaucracy of China. Let's dive in. To really get a handle on Kublai, you have to look at where he came from. He was a man literally caught between two completely different worlds. On one hand, you've got the windswept plains of Mongolia, and on the other, the ancient, complex courts of China. And this duality, it's going to shape every single thing he does. And you can really see these two worlds pulling him in opposite directions. On one side, you have his Mongol heritage. I mean, he's the grandson of Genghis Khan, raised on horseback, a product of pure conquest. But then, on the other side, he had this deep, genuine fascination with Chinese culture. He surrounded himself with Buddhist monks and Confucian scholars, trying to soak it all in. This was just not normal for a Mongol prince back then. While all his peers were focused pretty much exclusively on warfare, Kublai was over here learning about philosophy, how to run a government, and religion from guys like the Buddhist monk Yuan. And this wasn't just some side hobby for him. It was the foundation he was building for his entire future empire. Okay, so before he could get to the ruling part, he had a little unfinished family business to take care of. His grandfather Genghis had started the conquest of China, but the job wasn't done. The rich and incredibly powerful Southern Song dynasty was still standing, and taking them down, that was going to be Kublai's first great test. And let me tell you, this was no quick fight. We're talking about a decades-long slog. Kublai was super methodical about it. First, he secured his southern flank by taking over the Dali kingdom. Then, he launched this all-out invasion of the Southern Song. After years and years of brutal fighting, his top general, Bayan, finally took the Song capital, and the imperial family surrendered. But even that wasn't the end, until the very last bit of the Song navy was wiped out in a huge sea battle. So let's pause on that date, 1279. This is a huge moment in history. For the first time ever, a ruler who wasn't Han Chinese was in control of all of China proper. Kublai had done it. He'd unified this massive, fractured land and finished a conquest his grandfather could only have dreamed of. But you know what they say, winning the war, that was the easy part. The real challenge, the massive challenge, was figuring out how to govern this unbelievably complex and ancient empire. You just couldn't rule China from a tent on the plains. And this whole internal conflict, well, it didn't stay internal for long. It exploded into a full-blown, bloody civil war. While Kublai was being declared the Great Khan in China, his own brother, Arik Bokeh, was being elected by the old-school Mongols back home. The war that followed was brutal, and it really marked the beginning of the end for a truly unified Mongol empire. Kublai won, but it came at a huge cost. So how do you manage this gigantic, diverse new empire? Well, Kublai came up with this really rigid four-class social system. At the very top, of course, were the Mongols, the ruling class. Now, this second group is fascinating. They were called the Simu, which literally means people with colored eyes. These were foreigners, Central Asians, Muslims, even Europeans that Kublai brought in as administrators. He trusted them because their loyalty was to him and him alone, not to any local Chinese groups. Below them were the Han, or Northern Chinese, and right at the bottom were the Nenren, the Southern Chinese, who were the last to be conquered and, well, the least trusted. All right, so with the empire more or less under control, Kublai just unleashed this wave of incredible, ambitious reforms. He wasn't just trying to keep things running. He was actively building something totally new, something that was neither purely Mongol nor purely Chinese. And this was a massive symbolic move. By creating a new dynasty with a Chinese name, the Yuan, he was basically telling everyone, hey, I'm not just a foreign conqueror. I'm a legitimate emperor of China, and I have the mandate of heaven. He literally put his strategy on the map. He moved the entire center of the Mongol Empire from the traditional capital of Karakoram, way out in Mongolia, to a brand new, magnificent capital city called Daedu, which is right where modern-day Beijing stands. This move firmly planted his rule in China. And when it came to the economy, wow, he was a total revolutionary. Kublai's government rolled out the world's first unified paper currency that wasn't backed by gold or silver. This was fiat money, an idea that was just wild for the 13th century. It made trade and taxes way easier, but it also opened the door to a very modern problem: inflation. So, what exactly is this fiat money we're talking about? It's pretty simple, actually. Its value comes from you trusting the government that issues it, not because you can trade it for a chunk of gold. It's the system pretty much every country uses today. But back then, that was a mind-blowing concept. But Kublai's big ideas didn't stop there, not by a long shot. He invested huge amounts of money into public works, like rebuilding the Grand Canal, extending highways, and he sponsored the arts and sciences. And get this, he also invested heavily in public education. Just get a load of this number: 20,166. That's not a typo. According to the official records, that's how many public schools were set up during his reign. That is a staggering figure, and it shows you he was a ruler who was thinking about more than just conquest. He was thinking about culture and long-term stability. But here's the thing about massive ambition. Sometimes it doesn't know when to stop. Kublai's ambition was almost limitless, and that overreach led to some really costly, really humiliating failures that kind of soured the later years of his rule. And the most famous example of this overreach? It really comes down to one number: 2. And the most famous example of this overreach, it really comes down to one number: 2. That's how many times Kublai Khan tried to launch a massive naval invasion of Japan. And both times it was an absolute, unmitigated disaster. I mean, the sheer scale of these invasions is just mind-boggling. The first attempt in 1274 used 900 ships. But he wasn't about to give up. The second invasion, in 1281, was one of the largest naval forces ever assembled in the pre-modern world. Over 4,000 ships. Just a staggering show of force. And yet, despite all that power, both times his gigantic fleets were just wiped out, annihilated by these massive typhoons, which the Japanese famously called kamikaze, or the divine wind. These storms didn't just save Japan, they delivered a massive blow to Kublai's reputation. For the first time, the myth that the Mongols were invincible was completely shattered. So when his very long reign finally came to an end in 1294, what are we left with? What's his legacy? Well, it's about as complex and divided as the man himself. He was a unifier, a builder, an innovator, but also an autocrat whose failures were just as colossal as his successes. And that brings us right back to where we started. Was he a Mongol Khagan who put on the robes of a Chinese emperor, or was he something new, something else entirely? You know, maybe the truest answer is that he wasn't really one or the other. Kublai Khan was the architect of a new kind of empire, a multicultural experiment that tried to fuse the nomadic world with ancient civilization. And that audacious attempt, that's a legacy that is absolutely worth exploring.